The Draconian hegemony had ruled the galaxy through fear for longer than most species could remember. And in all that time, no civilization had ever survived the arrival of a full Draconian invasion fleet. Because no civilization had ever possessed the means to do so, and no civilization had ever possessed the will to try. Their warships were enormous things built from black metal and spite, each one large enough to block out the light of a star. And when they moved through space, they moved in formations so vast that entire sectors went dark as they passed. And the species who lived in those sectors would look up at their skies and see nothing but shadow, and know that somewhere out there, something ancient and terrible was on its way to end someone. The galaxy had learned a long time ago that the Draconians did not negotiate, and they did not accept surrender. And they did not take prisoners unless they needed slaves. And so when the Galactic Council received a formal call for aid, they knew that this was not a matter of diplomacy. It was a matter of survival. Declaration of subjugation aimed at a species called humanity. Most of the elder races simply shook their heads and looked away, because they had seen this before and they knew how it ended. Humanity was young and small and largely unimpressive by galactic standards. A civilization barely 2 centuries into faster-than-light travel, occupying a modest cluster of 12 colony worlds around an unremarkable yellow star in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy. And most of the council had not even bothered to learn their name until the Draconian Declaration forced them to. Ambassador Zaelthar of the Velkari Confederacy was not most of the council, and she had been watching humanity with quiet curiosity for several decades, because they reminded her of her own people, back when her own people had still possessed the courage to be curious. And so when the declaration was announced, she made it her personal mission to warn the human delegation before it was too late. Human ambassador, in a small office on the 47th floor of the council station, a calm woman with silver hair and steady hands, named Director Marin Voss, and she told her everything she knew about the Draconians, about the 12,000 warships, and the 3 planet-cracking siege engines, and the flagship called the Obsidian Maw, that was said to be the size of a small moon. And she told her about all the civilizations that had come before, and how none of them existed anymore. She expected grief, or panic, or desperate pleas for alliance, because that was what every other species had done when faced with the same news. But Director Voss simply listened and nodded, and when Zalthar was finished, the human woman thanked her, and said that they had been watching the Draconian fleet approach for 6 months, and that they were ready. Zalthar did not know what to do with that answer, because ready was not a word that applied to species facing the draconic hegemony. Told the director as much, and the director smiled at her in a way that was not unkind, but was also not afraid, and she said that she appreciated the concern, and that the Velkari had always been good neighbors, and that she hoped they would continue to be good neighbors after this was over. After this was over, Zaelthar thought, as though there would be an after. The first Extinction Armada entered the Sol approach corridor on the 17th day of the galactic month, and every intelligence network in known space was watching, because the destruction of a civilization was always worth observing, if only to update one's own threat assessments. And the relay drones positioned along the corridor fed real-time data to 100 different species on 100 different worlds. 12,000 warships moved through the dark in perfect formation, their hulls reflecting no light, their engines burning with the cold blue fire that had become a symbol of death across 1,000 conquered systems. And at the center of the formation, the Obsidian Maw drifted like a mountain given purpose. And aboard it, Supreme Warlord Krath Vomoun stood on his command bridge and looked out at the stars ahead, and felt nothing but contempt for the small, soft creatures who lived among them. The fleet crossed the outer boundary of human-controlled space at exactly the 14th hour, and the sensor stations tracked every ship as it passed the threshold, and the data was clean and clear, and there was no ambiguity about what was happening. And for several minutes, Everything proceeded exactly as the galaxy expected it to. And then, everything stopped. It did not stop the way a battle stops, with explosions and debris and the screaming of dying ships across emergency frequencies. And it did not stop the way a retreat stops, with engines flaring and formations breaking and the desperate mathematics of escape. And it did not stop the way a surrender stops, channels opening and white flags being transmitted across all known protocols. It simply stopped. Every ship vanished from every sensor at the same moment, and there were no energy signatures, and there was no debris, and there were no distress calls, and there was no flash of light or ripple of displaced space, or any other indication that 12,000 warships, crewed by over 9 million Draconians, had ever existed at all. The sensor stations recorded nothing because there was nothing to record, and the relay drones captured nothing because there was nothing to capture, and the intelligence analysts on 100 different worlds stared at their screens and saw only empty space, where moments before there had been the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever assembled. The Valkyrie rechecked their instruments 17 times and found no malfunction, and the Orath Communion sent fast response probes to the last known coordinates and found nothing. Crithian Directorate ran every scan they had, in every spectrum they could detect, and found absolutely nothing at all. 12,000 warships and 9 million souls had entered human space, and had simply ceased to be. The galaxy did not know what to do with this information, because the galaxy had no framework for processing it, and for several hours there was simply silence, as every civilization tried to understand what had just happened, and failed. Zalthar watched the empty sensor feeds from her office on the council station, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. And it took her several minutes to identify the emotion, because it had been so long since she had experienced it. And when she finally recognized it, she sat down heavily in her chair, because the emotion was fear. But it was not fear of the Draconians. It was fear of humanity. The Galactic Press Corps descended on the human delegation within hours, demanding answers, explanations, and some kind of accounting for what had just occurred in the space around their sun. And Director Marin Voss stood before them with the same calm expression she had worn when Zalthar had warned her, and she listened to their questions, and she waited for them to finish. And when they were finished, she smiled, and said that the Draconian fleet had arrived, and that they had handled it. And then she asked if there were any other questions. The room was very quiet after that. The weeks that followed the disappearance were the strangest the galaxy had known in living memory. And the strangeness was not the kind that fades with time, but the kind that grows deeper the longer one sits with it. Because the galaxy had built its entire understanding of power around the idea that strength could be measured and compared and predicted. And what humanity had done could not be measured or compared or predicted. And that meant the galaxy did not understand what humanity was anymore. The Draconian hegemony was the first to react, and it reacted the way wounded predators always react, which is to say with rage and denial. And Supreme Warlord Krath Vomoon stood before his war council in the Iron Throne Room of the hegemony capital, and declared that the first Extinction Armada had not been destroyed by humans, because humans were insects, and insects did not destroy armadas, and therefore one of the elder galactic powers must have secretly allied with humanity and used some hidden weapon to ambush his fleet in transit. His generals listened and said nothing, because they had all seen the sensor data, and they all knew that no elder power possessed the ability to make 12,000 warships vanish without a trace. But saying this to Krath Vomoon was not something one did if one wished to continue breathing, and so they nodded and agreed, and began planning the response he demanded. Meanwhile, the rest of the galaxy decided independently, and almost simultaneously, that the most important thing anyone could do was find out what humanity had done, and so a dozen civilizations launched intelligence operations aimed at penetrating human space and learning the secret that had swallowed an armada. The Valkyrie sent cloaked observation drones, and the Crithian Directorate sent sensor-shielded probe ships, and the Oreth Communion sent living scouts wrapped in layers of psychic concealment that had never been detected by any technology in the galaxy. History. And the Tavan Syndicate simply paid an enormous sum of money to a smuggler and told him to fly into human space and come back with answers. None of them came back with answers. Every probe and drone and spy ship and cloaked scout that crossed the boundary into what the galaxy was now calling the Sol Exclusion Zone vanished in exactly the same way the Draconian fleet had vanished, which is to say, completely and without any detectable cause, and the intelligence agencies on a dozen worlds began to panic, because whatever humanity had done, it was apparently still active, and it apparently did not distinguish between warships and spy drones. But then, something unexpected happened, because the probes came back. Every single one of them reappeared outside human borders exactly where they had entered, intact and undamaged and perfectly functional in every way, except that their memory cores had been completely and cleanly wiped. Message written in every known galactic language that said the same thing. Boundary respected, it said. Please knock next time. The intelligence agencies did not know what to make of this, and so they did what intelligence agencies always do when they do not know what to make of something, which is to classify it and file it, and pretend they were still in control of the situation. Ambassador Jailthar took a different approach, because she was not an intelligence agent, and she was not a military strategist, and she was not a politician in the way that most council members were politicians. And she understood that sometimes the best way to learn about someone was simply to ask, and so she submitted a formal diplomatic request to visit Earth. The request was granted almost immediately, which surprised her, because she had expected weeks of negotiation and conditions and security protocols, and instead she received a cheerful message from the human diplomatic office, saying they would be delighted to host her, and asking whether she had any dietary restrictions. She traveled to Earth aboard a Valkyrie diplomatic vessel, and she crossed the boundary into human space with her hearts beating fast, and her scales pale with anxiety. And she waited for the vanishing, but it did not come, and her ship arrived in orbit above Earth without incident. What she saw from orbit confused her, because she had expected a fortress world, a planet armored in orbital defense platforms and weapon satellites, and the visible machinery of whatever terrible power had consumed the Draconian fleet. But Earth looked like nothing more than a blue and green and white jewel hanging in the dark, and there were no defense platforms, and there were no weapon satellites, and there was nothing in orbit that looked even remotely military. She landed in a city called Geneva, and was met by a young human officer named Lieutenant Rana Chado, who had a wide smile and an easy manner, and who shook her hand with genuine warmth and told her he was honored to meet a Valkyrie in person, because he had read about her people in school, and had always thought their architecture was beautiful. He took her on a tour of the city, and she saw humans going about their ordinary lives, buying food in markets, and sitting in parks, and arguing about things that had nothing to do with war, and she saw children playing in the streets, and elderly people feeding birds by a lake, and a group of young humans playing music on a corner, and none of them seemed afraid, and none of them seemed like they were living on a world that had just made the most powerful military in the galaxy disappear. She asked Ren where the military installations were, and he said there were some bases in various places, but nothing special. And she asked where the weapon was, and he looked at her with genuine confusion, and said, "What weapon?" And she stared at him, and he stared back, and she realized, with a chill, that either he was the most accomplished liar she had ever met, or he truly did not know what she was talking about. She spent 3 days on Earth, and in those 3 days she ate human food, and walked through human museums, and watched human children chase each other through gardens, and listened to human music played by human hands. And she found no weapons, and no military secrets, and no trace of whatever had consumed the Draconian fleet. And when she left, she was more frightened than when she had arrived, because the absence of answers was itself an answer. Whatever humanity had done to the Draconian armada, it was not a weapon in any way that Saelthar understood the word, and it was not hidden in bunkers or disguised as civilian infrastructure. And it was something so far beyond her frame of reference that the humans who lived under its protection apparently did not even think about it. She returned to the council station and filed her report, simply that she had found nothing, and the council did not know what to do with that either. Far away in the Iron Throne Room of the hegemony capital, Krath the Moon stood before his war council again and announced that the Second Extinction Armada was ready. 30,000 warships, augmented with stolen technology from 3 conquered species, and armed with every terrible weapon the hegemony had ever built. And he said that he would lead it personally from the bridge of the super dreadnought called God's Fang. And he said that he would burn Earth to cinders and scatter the ashes across the void. His generals nodded and said nothing. And in a classified facility orbiting Neptune, deep in the outer reaches of the Sol system, a team of human scientists sat in a quiet room and watched a shimmering distortion in the air that was not quite light and not quite shadow, but something in between. And one of them looked up from her console and said that the Draconians were sending another fleet. The project lead was an old man named Dr. Oren Bask, who had been working in this room for 30 years, and who had gray hair and tired eyes, and hands that were steady in the way that only very calm people or very frightened people have steady hands. And he sighed and said, "Same protocol." And then he looked at his assistant and asked her to put the kettle on because it was going to be a long night. The Second Extinction Armada was the largest military force the Draconian hegemony had ever assembled in its long and bloody history. And Krath the Moon had built it not just to conquer, but to make a statement. Because the disappearance of the First Fleet had made the hegemony look weak, and weakness in the eyes of the galaxy was something that could not be tolerated. 30,000 warships moved through the void in a formation that stretched across light years, and at the heart of the formation, the super dreadnought God's Fang moved like a cathedral of war, its hull bristling with weapons that had been designed to crack planets and shatter moons and reduce entire civilizations to ash. And on its bridge, Krath the Moon stood with his claws wrapped around the railing and his yellow eyes fixed on the stars ahead, and he felt in his chest the old familiar hunger that his kind had always felt before a conquest. And this time, there were even more relay drones positioned along the approach corridor, because every civilization wanted to see what would happen, and every civilization was afraid of what they might see. And the data feeds were broadcasting to 100 worlds in real time, and billions of beings across known space held their breath and waited. The fleet crossed the boundary into human space. For exactly 4 7/10 of a second, the relay drones detected something that no sensor in galactic history had ever recorded before. A spatial distortion so enormous and so profound that it briefly warped the local curvature of spacetime across a region spanning 3 light years. And in that instant, every physicist watching the data felt something inside them go cold, because what they were seeing should not have been possible. And yet, there it was, written in the mathematics of the universe itself. And then the fleet was gone. 30,000 warships and the millions of Draconians who crewed them vanished in the same silent and absolute way that the First Fleet had vanished, without explosion or debris, or any of the things that are supposed to happen when ships are destroyed. And the galaxy stared at the empty space where the most powerful armada ever assembled had been, and felt the same helpless confusion it had felt before, but deeper now, and edged with something that tasted like dread. But this time the vanishing was not total. A single Draconian escape pod tumbled out of the distortion in the instant before it closed, thrown clear by forces that the pod's own systems could not identify, and it drifted across the boundary into neutral space, where a Velkari patrol ship picked it up and brought it aboard. Inside the pod was a Draconian officer named Sub-Commander Vitha Sen, and she was alive, but she was not well, because her scales had gone white, which was something that only happened to Draconians in states of absolute terror. And her eyes were open, but they were not seeing anything in the room around her. And she did not speak or move or respond to any stimulus for 6 days. Zaelthar came to the medical station where Vitha was being held, because she needed to hear what the Draconian had seen. And she sat beside the bed and waited with the patience that her people were known for. And on the 7th day, Vitha Sen blinked and turned her head, and looked at Zaelthar and began to speak in a voice that was barely a whisper. She said that when the fleet crossed the boundary, space itself had changed around them, and the stars had bent and twisted like reflections in disturbed water. And the ships had not been destroyed, because destruction would have been something she could understand, and instead the ships had been moved. She said that the fleet had been folded into somewhere else, a place that was not a place in any way that her mind could process, a vast and lightless space that existed alongside normal reality but was not part of it. And in that space the ships had become very small, not physically smaller, but small in the way that a single grain of sand is small when placed on the floor of an ocean. She said that she had seen the obsidian maw from the first fleet drifting in that darkness, still intact, but powerless and tiny against the scale of what surrounded it. And she had seen the other ships of the first armada scattered like dust motes in a cathedral. And she had understood in that moment that the first fleet had not been destroyed either, and that every Draconian aboard those ships was still alive somewhere in that impossible dark. And then she stopped speaking, and her white scales grew whiter, and her voice dropped to something that was almost not a voice at all, and she said that something in the dark had noticed them. She said it was not a creature in the way that she understood creatures, and it was not a machine, and it was not a god, though. It was closer to a god than anything she had ever imagined, and it was vast beyond her ability to describe. So vast that the 30,000 warships of the Second Armada were to it what bacteria were to a planet. And it had turned its attention toward them the way a person might turn to look at a sound in another room. Not with hostility, but with a kind of enormous and alien curiosity. And she said that in the moment before her escape pod was thrown clear, she had felt something else in the dark. Something that was not the vast entity, but was connected to it, and it was human. And the human presence had been calm and warm, and had spoken to the entity the way a person speaks to a friend. And it had told the entity where to look, and the entity had looked, and the fleet had been gathered up like leaves in a gentle hand, and placed somewhere safe and dark and quiet. Zaelthar sat in silence for a long time after Vitha finished speaking, took Vitha's testimony and combined it with the sensor data from both disappearances and the spatial distortion that had been detected during the second event. And they ran models and simulations and calculations, and what they found changed everything. Humanity had not built a weapon. Humanity had built a doorway. Somewhere in the preceding decades, human scientists had discovered how to breach the membrane between normal space and a parallel dimensional realm that existed alongside reality. And in that realm, they had found something alive, something ancient and aware, and so large that the concept of size barely applied to it. And instead of sealing the breach and running, they had done something that no other species in the history of the galaxy would have done. They had said, hello. They had established communication with an entity that had existed since before the galaxy had formed, an entity that had spent billions of years alone in the dark between dimensions with nothing to talk to, and nothing to observe, and nothing to break the endless silence of its existence. And they had talked to it, and it had talked back. And over the years, a relationship had formed that was not quite alliance, and not quite friendship, but was something that had no word in any galactic language. The threshold, the humans called it, though the name was a poor fit for something so vast and so old. And when the Draconian hegemony had sent its fleets to destroy humanity, the humans had simply opened the door, and the threshold had reached through and gathered the fleets up and placed them somewhere safe. Not because it hated the Draconians, but because the humans had asked it to, and it cared about what the humans asked, because the humans were the only beings in billions of years who had cared enough to speak to it. The galaxy received this information, and the galaxy did not know what to do with it, because the implications were so large. Strange that they did not fit inside any existing framework of politics or strategy or theology. Humanity had not conquered a monster, or built an ultimate weapon, or discovered some secret technology that gave them military superiority. They had found something lonely in the dark, and they had been kind to it. And in return, it had made them untouchable. Dr. Oren Bask stood in the facility orbiting Neptune and looked at the shimmering anomaly that was humanity's connection to the threshold. And the anomaly pulsed gently with light that was not quite light. And he spoke to it softly, the way he had been speaking to it for 30 years. He told it that the rest of the galaxy was going to want to talk to it eventually. All of them, every species and every civilization, and every frightened and curious mind in known space. And he asked if it was ready for that. The anomaly pulsed once, warm and slow, and the room filled with a deep resonant sound that was felt more. Then heard a sound like a heartbeat, coming from somewhere impossibly far away. And Oren Bask, who had spent his life learning to read the moods of an entity older than the stars, felt in that pulse something that might have been amusement and might have been anticipation, and was definitely not afraid. He smiled and sat down and picked up his tea. The Galactic Council Chamber was the largest enclosed space in known civilization, a vast dome of crystal and light that floated in the void between 3 star systems. And it had been built 10,000 years ago to hold the voices of every species that had ever achieved faster than light travel. And in all those 10,000 years, it had never been as full or as silent as it was on the day that director Maren Voss walked to the central podium and prepared to speak. Every seat was occupied, and every delegation was present, and the observation galleries were packed with journalists and scholars and military analysts from civilizations that had not sent representatives to the council in centuries. Because what had happened in human space had shaken the foundations of galactic order in a way that nothing had shaken them before. And everyone wanted to hear what the humans would say. Zylthar sat in the Valkyrie delegation section and watched Maren Voss approach the podium. And she noticed that the human woman walked the same way she always walked, with the same unhurried calm, as though she were crossing a garden and not standing before the collective gaze of a trillion beings. Voss placed her hands on the podium and looked out at the assembly, and she did not smile, and she did not appear nervous, and she spoke in a voice that was clear and even, and carried to every corner of that enormous room. She told them the truth. She said that 60 years ago, a team of human physicists working on an experimental project in the outer reaches of the Sol system had accidentally breached the membrane that separated normal space from what lay between dimensions, and that what they found on the other side was not empty and was not dead, but was alive and aware, and had been alive and aware for longer than the galaxy itself had existed. She said that the entity they found existed in a space that humans had come to call the threshold, that ran parallel to normal reality, the way a shadow runs parallel to the thing that casts it, and that the entity had no name in any language because it had never needed one, because it had never had anyone to give it one. She said that when the breach was opened, the entity had noticed the way a person might notice a window being opened in a room they had occupied alone for billions of years. And the human scientists on the other side of that window had been terrified, because they understood immediately that what they were looking at was something so far beyond their comprehension that the distance could not be measured. And then she paused, and something in her expression changed, and Zalthar saw in that moment something she had never seen on the director's face before, which was tenderness. Voss said that the scientists had been afraid, but they had not closed the window, and they had not run, and they had not called for weapons or defenses or any of the things that fear usually demands, and instead a young researcher whose name was not important had looked through the breach into that vast and ancient dark, and had said simply, and without any particular eloquence, "Hey there." And the dark had answered. She said that the process of establishing communication had taken 11 years and had been the hardest thing humanity had ever done. Not because the entity was hostile, but because it was so different from anything human that the concept of language had to be rebuilt from the ground up. And the humans who worked on the project had to learn to think in ways that human minds were not designed to think. And some of them had struggled greatly with that, and some of them had been changed by it in ways that were hard to describe. But they had done it, and over the decades that followed, a relationship had formed. And the entity that humans called the Threshold had become something that was not quite a friend and not quite a guardian, something that had never existed before in the history of the universe, which was a connection between a being that was older than the stars and a species that was younger than most of the furniture in this very chamber. She said that the Threshold was not hostile to any species and had no interest in galactic politics, and did not wish to be worshipped or feared. And she said that when the Draconian fleets had come to destroy humanity, the Threshold had intervened not because it hated the Draconians, but because it cared about the small, fragile beings who had opened a window into its loneliness and said hello. And then she said the thing that made the chamber go so quiet that Zalthar could hear her own heart's beating. She said that the crews of both Draconian fleets were alive. Every single one of them, all 9 million from the first fleet and all the millions from the second fleet, suspended in a pocket dimension that the Threshold had created for them. Imprisoned but held. Not harmed but kept. And they were alive and they were intact. And humanity was prepared to return them immediately, on the condition that the Draconian hegemony signed a permanent non-aggression treaty. The chamber erupted in noise, and it took a long time for order to be restored. And when it was restored, the first voice that spoke was the voice of the Draconian delegation, and the voice was shaking with rage, and the voice belonged to an ambassador who had been given his instructions by Krathvamuan himself. The ambassador said that humanity was a plague, and that the Threshold was an abomination, and that any species that made deals with entities from outside reality was a threat to all life everywhere. And he said that the hegemony rejected the offer and demanded the immediate return of its soldiers without conditions, and that failure to comply would be considered an act of war. Maren Voss listened to this, and when the ambassador was finished, she said, simply, that the offer would remain open and that there was no deadline. The days that followed were chaotic in a way that the Council had not experienced in millennia, because the galaxy was splitting into factions, not along the usual lines of power and territory, but along a line that no one had anticipated, which was the line between those who were afraid of what humanity represented and those who were curious about it. Krathvamun broadcast a message to every civilization in known space, calling humanity the leash holders of an abomination, and calling for a grand alliance to contain them before their pet monster consumed the galaxy. And several species listened because fear is a powerful motivator, and the idea of an entity that could swallow fleets was terrifying, regardless of whether it was hostile. But other species listened to Zalthar, who had walked on Earth, and seen the children playing, and the markets bustling, and the musicians on the corner, and who had stood before Vitha Sen, and heard the Draconian describe not a weapon of mass destruction, but something that had reached out with what could only be described as gentleness. And Zaelthar argued that humanity was not a threat, but something the galaxy had never seen before, which was a species that had been given absolute power, and had chosen not to use it. She argued this point in the council chamber, and in private meetings, and in public broadcasts, and she argued it because she believed it, because she had looked into Marin Voss's eyes, and had seen not the cold calculation of a conqueror, but the quiet resolve of someone who was carrying a responsibility that most species could not even imagine. And then Zaelthar did something that no alien diplomat had ever done before. She submitted a formal request to speak with the Threshold directly. The request went through the human diplomatic channels and was considered at the highest levels of human government. Days the answer came back, and the answer was yes. And Zaelthar traveled to the facility orbiting Neptune, and was met by Dr. Oren Bask, who was kind and tired, and who led her through corridors that were plain and undecorated, to a room that was small and quiet, and that contained at its center the shimmering anomaly that was the window between worlds. She stood before it, and she was trembling, because she was not brave in the way that humans were brave, and she knew it. And the anomaly pulsed gently, and the room filled with that deep resonant sound that Vitha Sen had described. And then something touched her mind. It was not words, and it was not images, and it was not anything that her senses were equipped to process. But it was meaning, pure and raw and vast, and the meaning washed over her like a wave, and in that wave she felt something that she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe. The entity spoke to her without language, and what it said was this. Said that humans were small and fragile, and that their lives were so short that by the standards of the Threshold they barely existed at all. And it said that despite this smallness and this fragility, they had walked into its dark, and they had not run. And they had said hello, and it asked her if she understood how brave that was. It said that it had been alone for longer than her stars had burned, and that the loneliness of that time was something that no living mind could comprehend. And it said that when the humans came and spoke to it, the loneliness had not ended, but it had changed. And for the first time in billions of years, the dark had contained something other than silence. And then it said the thing that broke her. It said that it would not let them be destroyed, not by the Draconians, and not by anyone. Not because they were powerful, and not because they were useful, and not because of any strategic calculation, but because they had been kind. Billions of years of its existence, kindness was the rarest thing it had ever encountered. Zaelthar left the facility with tears running down her face, and she did not speak for a long time. 1 year after the disappearance of the second Draconian fleet, the galaxy was a different place. Not because its borders had changed, or because its wars had ended, or because any great empire had risen or fallen in the traditional sense, but because something had shifted in the way that civilizations thought about power and about fear and about what it meant to be strong. The Draconian hegemony was the first and most visible sign of this change, because the hegemony that had terrified the galaxy for millennia was tearing itself apart from the inside, and the cause of its destruction was not a weapon or an invasion, but a single Draconian woman who refused to stop talking. Sub-Commander Vitha Sen had never wanted to be famous, and she had certainly never wanted to be the person who brought down the most feared military empire in known space. But the galaxy had decided that she was going to be that person, whether she liked it or not. And so she stood before every camera, and every audience, and every tribunal that would have her, and she told the truth about what she had seen. She told them about the dark and the vastness and the entity that lived there, and she told them that the Draconian soldiers who had been taken were alive and unharmed. And she told them that humanity had offered to return every single one of them in exchange for nothing more than a promise of peace. And she told them that Krath Vamun had refused this offer because his pride was worth more to him than the lives of millions of his own people. This testimony did what no military force in history had been able to do, which was to make the Draconian people question the authority of their warlord. It did not happen quickly, because the Draconians were a proud and martial species, and obedience was woven into their culture as deeply as breathing. But Vitha was also a Draconian, and she was also proud, and she spoke not as a traitor, but as a soldier who had seen the truth, believed that her people deserved to hear it. The generals who had nodded silently in the Iron Throne Room began to speak privately among themselves, and the military commanders who had lost friends and family in the vanished fleets began to ask publicly why their warlord had refused the offer to bring them home. And the civilian population, who had been told that the humans were monsters, began to wonder why monsters would keep their enemies alive. Krath Vamun felt his power slipping, and he responded the only way he knew how, which was with force. But the force he directed was aimed at his own people, and that was a mistake that even the most loyal Draconian could not forgive. And within 3 months the generals who had once nodded in silence stood before him with weapons drawn and told him that his war was over. He was removed from power and replaced by a council of generals who immediately accepted humanity's terms, and the non-aggression treaty was signed in the same council chamber where Marin Voss had first told the galaxy the truth, and Vitha Sen stood beside the Draconian delegation as a witness, because the generals had insisted on it. The Draconian crews were returned as promised, all of them, delivered gently back into normal space in their own ships which were undamaged and fully functional. And the soldiers who emerged were disoriented and shaken, but they were whole and they were alive, and many of them wept when they saw the stars again, because they had been in the dark for a long time, and they had not known if they would ever leave it. The galaxy watched the return of the fleets and the signing of the treaty, and it struggled to process what it was seeing, because what it was seeing was unprecedented. Not the defeat of a great empire, because empires had been defeated before, but the way it had been done, because humanity had been given the power to destroy the hegemony completely, and instead they had dismantled it with patience and mercy and the simple stubborn insistence that their enemies deserved to live. The Galactic Council spent months debating what humanity's new role in galactic society should be, and the debates were fierce, because some species wanted humanity declared a protectorate power, with authority over military matters, and other species wanted humanity contained and monitored and prevented from expanding their relationship with the threshold. And still other species simply wanted to pretend that none of this had happened, and go back to the way things were before. But the truth was that humanity did not want any of these things. And when asked what they wanted from the galaxy, Director Marin Voss said simply that they wanted to be good neighbors. And this answer frustrated the Council enormously, because the Council was built on the assumption that every species wanted something, and that politics was the art of managing those wants. And a species that wanted nothing was a species that could not be negotiated with. What humanity became instead was something that had no precedent in galactic history, which was a bridge, because they were the only species capable of communicating with the threshold, and they made it clear that this communication was not a resource to be hoarded, or a weapon to be wielded, but a relationship to be honored, and they opened the door to any species that wished to attempt contact with the entity on the other side. Several species accepted the offer, and most of them failed to establish communication, because the threshold was so alien that most minds could not hold the connection. But some of them succeeded, and each success changed the species that achieved it in ways that were subtle and profound and impossible to predict. The galaxy was learning slowly and painfully that the universe was not what it had thought it was, and that the dark between the stars was not empty, but was full of things that were old and strange and alive, and that the first species to discover this had not been one of the ancient and powerful civilizations that had ruled for millennia, but a young and small and seemingly unremarkable species that had looked into the void and instead of flinching, had waved. Zaelthar wrote about all of this, because writing was what she did when the world became too large and too strange to hold inside her own mind. And the book she produced became the most widely read document in galactic history, translated into every language and distributed to every world, and read by beings who had never heard of the Velkari or the Draconians or Earth, but who found in her words something that resonated with them in a way they could not quite explain. The book was called The Window in the Dark, and its central argument was simple and devastating. She wrote that every civilization in the galaxy had spent its entire existence asking whether it was alone in the universe, and that this question had driven every great endeavor, and every great fear, and every great hope that any species had ever known. But she wrote that no civilization had ever thought to ask the deeper question, which was whether the universe itself was alone. She wrote that humanity had asked that question, not with telescopes or sensors or mathematics, but with the simple act of reaching out and speaking into the dark. And she wrote that the answer they had received had changed everything, because the answer was yes. The universe had been alone, and it had been alone for a very long time, and it had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting for someone to notice. She wrote that this was what made humanity different, not their technology, and not their military, and not their politics, but their instinct when faced with the unknown to reach out rather than pull back, to speak rather than shoot, to say hello to the dark, and mean it. The book ended with a passage that became the most quoted sentence in galactic literature, and it said simply that we spent millennia asking whether we were alone in the universe, but we never thought to ask whether the universe itself was alone. And humanity did, and that made all the difference. In the months after the book was published, Zaelthar received messages from species she had never heard of, on worlds she had never visited, telling her that her words had changed the way they thought about everything. And she was grateful for these messages, but she also knew that the words were not really hers, because the truth they contained had been shown to her in a small room orbiting Neptune by something that was older than the stars. On a warm afternoon on Earth, in the city of Geneva, director Maren Voss sat in a garden, surrounded by flowers that she could not name because she had never been particularly good with plants, and she read reports on a tablet, and drank tea, and enjoyed the sunlight on her face. And Lieutenant Ren Achado came through the garden gate with a fresh pot of tea and a smile. He sat down across from her and poured the tea, and she asked him how the threshold was doing. And he grinned in that easy way of his, and said that it had been asking about music again. Voss laughed softly, because the threshold's fascination with human music had become something of a running joke among the project staff, since the entity could process mathematical patterns that spanned galaxies, but was endlessly delighted by the simple arrangements of sound that humans made with their voices and their hands, and no one could quite explain why. She asked what they had played for it, and Ren said that Dr. Basque had introduced it to symphonies last week, and that the response had been extraordinary, and that the anomaly had pulsed in patterns that the communication team was still trying to fully interpret, but that the preliminary reading was something very close to wonder. Voss nodded, and sipped her tea, and looked up at the sky, which was blue and clear and ordinary, and somewhere beneath that sky and beneath the ground and beneath the fabric of reality itself, in the vast and ancient dark between dimensions, something that was older than the galaxy and larger than comprehension listened to a human symphony for the first time. It heard the violins rise and the cellos answer, and the brass swell like a sunrise, and the percussion mark the heartbeat of a species that had existed for the blink of an eye against the scale of its own existence. And in those sounds, it found something it had not felt in longer than any living mind could measure. It felt joy. Simple and warm and unexpected and entirely new, the way a light is new when it appears in a room that has been dark for so long that the concept of light has become theoretical. And the threshold held that joy carefully, the way one holds something precious and fragile. And it understood in that moment why it had chosen to protect these small and brief and impossibly brave creatures. They had walked into its dark, and they had brought music with them. And the galaxy took notice of humanity, not because they had destroyed an armada, or conquered an empire, or wielded a power beyond comprehension, but because they had found something ancient and alone in the space between the stars. And they had not run from it, and they had not tried to control it, and they had not worshipped it or feared it. They had simply been kind, and the dark had loved them for it.